Hello and welcome to StuffTV. I'm your host, Nick Huzar. I'm also the co-founder of OfferUp. And, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do I impact the planet. I thought I could Google this. And it was really hard to measure. And I decided to start StuffTV and interview really interesting thought leaders on topics around climate because it is complicated. But my hope is to make it simple and find really interesting guests to talk about. And so today I'm excited to have Tony Pan with his company, Modern Hydrogen. And hydrogen is really interesting. It's the most abundant element in the universe, and I also think it's a really important topic because I think one of the biggest challenges of our time is harnessing energy in different types of forms. And clearly, there's lots of demands on electricity. I see a lot of innovation with battery technology, but that's not always practical, especially with heavy machinery, things like planes and big trucks and things like that. So hydrogen is a very abundant element, but it's also one you got to be very thoughtful about how you move it around. And so I'm sure Tony will shed some light on all these things as we get into it today. But Tony, thanks for being here. We'd love to maybe have you introduce yourself and talk about how did you get into this space?
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. And I mean, we're for the listeners, we're both Seattle entrepreneurs, so we've known each other for a bit, and I'm a avid user of OfferUp. It's one of the great apps of our times. So I've been doing modern hydrogen. We are 8 years old in the Seattle area, and we basically decarbonize natural gas to produce clean hydrogen. And I got into this space really by working with an incubator in Seattle to tackle hard to decarbonize problems. Energy is one of the biggest sectors in world economy. We need to decarbonize many aspects. But even when I joined the fight about a decade ago, the climate fight, it was already pretty clear that solar and wind were going to go on an exponential decline of their production, of their electricity costs. And that would be a very good tool set to decarbonize our society. But it was also very clear to experts that that was not enough. To give you a sense, right, like only 1/3 of CO2 emissions are associated with electricity. And even for that, most experts don't think solar and wind can get us 100% of the way there. And even if it could, again, that's only 1/3 of the picture. So you need all these additional new tool sets and technologies to tackle the hard to decarbonize sectors. I work with the incubator to investigate many of those problems, and that led to the creation of modern hydrogen.
I know in the past we had talked a little bit about kind of how your company works, kind of figuring out what is the optimal way to do it. And at one point we talked about our natural gas grid in the US and how it's the largest, I believe, in the world. And are there ways to potentially leverage that? Are you still focusing on that, or is there kind of a new approach to how you think about scaling your company?
That's still right. I would say if there's two words to describe the value prop of what our company is doing, it's skip infrastructure. Here's the gist. Hydrogen is seen as the holy grail fuel because it's pretty much the only fuel you can burn without any CO2 emissions. So that's why there's a lot of investment and discussion and hype in the sector. But hydrogen has an Achilles heel. It's the lightest element in the universe. That makes it very hard to transport and distribute. I'm talking about moving around and storing it. To give you a sense of some numbers, if you compressed hydrogen as a gas to like a compressed tank and compare it with the same gasoline tank by volume, the hydrogen tank would only have 10% the energy compared to the gasoline tank. Again, it's just because hydrogen is very light, like per unit volume, it does not contain a lot of energy. You could move it around as a liquid if you cool it to very low temperatures, but the issue is you need to get to negative 250 Celsius before hydrogen turns from a gas to liquid. So it is exceedingly expensive and impractical to try to turn hydrogen into liquid and move it around that way. And so last but not least, you can move hydrogen around with pipes. And we do know how to do that, but you need brand new pipes. To give you a sense, the country today probably has less than 2,000 miles of dedicated hydrogen pipelines. In contrast, we already have 3 million miles of natural gas pipelines in the United States alone. So that took $1 trillion and a whole century to build up, but you cannot reuse that to transport hydrogen directly. You would have to spend another century and probably another $1 trillion to build up infrastructure to move hydrogen around to the same scale of natural gas. So we tech nerds sort of took a look at this and realized, hey, natural gas, it's chemical composition is CH4, one carbon, four hydrogen. So it's already majority hydrogen. We're already moving all this hydrogen around. It's just stuck to this pesky carbon atom that we don't like because when we burn it, it emits CO2 that causes global warming. So we're thinking, hey, why don't you just reuse all that infrastructure? The gas is already being transported to the end user. At the very last point of the pipe, pull out the carbon atom, then you're just left with clean hydrogen. Then you can get hydrogen to all these different places across the country without any need to build new infrastructure. Not only is that going to be a lot cheaper for the delivered price of hydrogen, but we think this can decarbonize, frankly, a lot faster. Because again, if you're going to wait for the pipelines to be built, new ones, you're probably, you and I will be dead by the time that's built up. So this is why we like our approach.
Mm-hmm. And back to the historical concerns around hydrogen is moving it around, right? And I love the fact that we have such an abundant grid that you can tap into, and now you're minimizing the need to move hydrogen around. And now you can also give it these other practical applications. So, battery technology, it's awesome. There's so much innovation investment in that space. The downside of batteries is they're really heavy. And so, there's this company, Universal Hydrogen, which I think is great. It was the former CTO of Airbus, and he's going to retrofit, these jets that run on hydrogen. That's probably the only way to decarbonize airplanes. You cannot put batteries in planes. It's way too heavy. It's just not going to work. Same thing with, trucks and fleets. And I read that article this last week at GeekWire. Kenworth they're announcing this new hydrogen, fuel truck, and a lot of these big heavy trucks are going to run on hydrogen. Again, it makes sense because you're not going to have, 10-ton batteries in these things. So now the challenge, back to what you're addressing, which I think makes a lot of sense, is like, okay, how do we just tap into it? If that truck's driving across the country, is there a way to get on the side of the road? And, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how your company is now converting this natural gas to hydrogen and how you see that happening. But, I think that makes a ton of sense because everyone's always scared of the Hindenburg. It's the first thing you mention hydrogen to people, like, things are going to blow up. But if you can minimize the amount of the hydrogen is actually traveling to be able to utilize it, then I think it creates a safer environment.
Oh, it'd be way safer, right? So that's exactly one of the applications of hydrogen, right? Like we have a lot of interest in building hydrogen refueling stations. So there'll be other companies downstream that are building the hydrogen trucks, hydrogen planes. That's not what we're in charge of. But we're in charge of, for example, making sure that there's hydrogen supply. These refueling stations and stuff like that exist. And so it's kind of crazy. Today, there's been some effort to build the hydrogen refueling stations, but most hydrogen today is made in some centralized plant far, far away and shipped hundreds, sometimes even 1,000 miles to the refueling station. Number one, as you've noticed, right? Now you're like literally today, because there's no pipes, they truck the hydrogen. That's a lot of hydrogen going on highways at very large volumes, which of course, if you're concerned about safety, that's not super safe.
Don't run into that truck.
Yeah. Second of all, right, the prices are crazy. If you went to like a hydrogen refueling station in like LA, you'd probably be paying like $15 per kilogram for the hydrogen. And that probably took less than 1.5 or $1 per kilogram to make. So the entire cost of the hydrogen you actually pay for, it's almost all the logistical cost of getting the hydrogen there. It's not the initial production cost. So that's the cost that we're trying to avoid by producing hydrogen on site wherever you can tap into a natural gas line.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. There's a lot of inefficiencies. Where are you as a company? Are you still kind of incubating and testing this? And what kind of applications have you tried?
To be very clear, we're at pilot stage, right? So we have pilot units like going to early customers, not at mass production scale yet. Think of us as at the stage of when Tesla was building and shipping its first Tesla Roadsters. That's how early in the journey we are. FYI, we're a startup, so we're about like 60 people, have raised about $100 million over the years, which in energy is actually not that much money. That's the scale. But what's exciting is that a lot of our customers are some of the biggest energy utilities in the country. We like that because they're very sophisticated, right? And in some sense, they see the same issues. They're under tremendous decarbonization pressure from regulators, from their customer base, but they're also very pragmatic. Actually, right? Like this climate fight is really, really hard. If you think about the challenges, you heard about like Lahaina burning down, and now like Hawaiian Electric Utility, their stock price has been tanked because everybody suspects one of their electricity grid lines got blown by the high winds and sparked the fire. Well,
they didn't shut it down fast enough. That's the heat they're getting.
Yeah, so it's like, what can you do, right? Like we'll need more electricity and more electricity lines to be able to use more renewable solar and wind. And yet, like that takes a lot of time, that takes a lot of cost, and that takes a lot of risk, right? I think famously Puget Sound, sorry, not Puget Sound, the one in California, right?
It's their energy equivalent. I don't
Yeah,
remember.
yeah. Their big utility went bankrupt a few years ago, also because of the wildfires, and it's also because they were pressured by all their regulators. It was easier for them to like build solar plants, but not maintain their transmission lines. Just the transmission infrastructure is very hard to build. It's NIMBYism and all of that, right? Like it's funny. The U.S. has 7 million miles of electricity transmission lines. Took a century to build that too,
Yeah.
and last year only a few hundred miles of new ones were permitted, and each of those permits was like a 15-year journey. Like it took like people applied 15 years ago and was finally permitted last year. So that's how slow we have the ability to build new infrastructure, and
Yeah.
all the utilities know this. So we're actually pretty excited that the utilities see the value prop of what modern hydrogen is doing, and they're like, okay, that's a smart solution because
Yeah.
that's using all the money and all the assets that are already in the ground
That's
and
right.
still finding a way to decarbonize.
It is crazy to think about, like my parents' generation, all the infrastructure that was built in the U.S. Like coming out of like World War II. Think about it. The like you said, all the the highway systems,
Yeah.
the electric lines, the gas lines, like massive bridges. Like we built crazy stuff back then. And now you look around. I can't remember. I did a long road trip with my buddy a few weeks ago. When's the last time you seen a major like highway put in this anywhere? Right.
Yeah.
And it just, I think that back to the point of if you really want to make an impact on the planet, it's super cool that you're able to leverage existing infrastructure because to back to your point, to build all these things out, like that's just we got to rethink that. We got to reimagine and utilize what we already have because it's not going to happen. Like there's no way we're going to build all this stuff fast enough.
I kind of wish we could, but pragmatically, it doesn't look like the
Well, look
case.
how long it takes us to do construction projects.
Yeah.
We're here in Seattle, right? Like we're building
Yeah.
this light rail system. It's gonna be a 15-year project, maybe 20-year project.
Yeah.
And
Did you
it's
hear,
just
like,
so
there was
slow.
some news that, like, Washington State got some federal money to investigate some high-speed rail between Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland, and the time frame that they're thinking of, like, 2050.
Oh, God. It just makes you want to pull your hair out, and it's
Yeah.
slow. And I learned this through a friend of mine that was talking about infrastructure, and he said, well, what happens is the way we tax, there's a bond the government gets issued, and that gets released in a certain sequence. That's why you only see. That's why construction projects. That's why you go by down the freeway and you see like
Mhm.
5 people on a mile stretch. Conversely, look at China. If they want to
Yeah.
put 4 miles in, there's 2,000 people on it, and it's there within a few days. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So I think that's some of the limiting factors. And then again, back to the point of bureaucracy and permitting. Like it's so hard to build stuff anymore. I
Yeah.
just think it was a lot easier back in the day. So it's really cool that you're able to leverage something that exists because that way you just don't have to deal with that hurdle.
Yeah. If I had a different skill set than being a technologist, if I was a good politician, that's why I would work
Oh,
on permit reform.
I would be a terrible politician. I probably would
Yeah.
just pull my hair out all day because the lack of
Yeah, me too.
progress. I
Yeah.
just couldn't do it. Well, I know one of the things you also do is sequester carbon.
Yeah, that's
Maybe
right.
can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this too. So we pull the carbon out of hydrogen, right? And the big question is, what do you do with the carbon? Generally, this issue that we're using a lot of fossil fuels and we need to avoid the CO2 going into the atmosphere, many folks have worked on it already. Usually, what people are trying to do is to capture the CO2 in its gaseous form. And then that takes a lot of energy to capture, but that's an offending thing you want to get rid of. And then since CO2 is not particularly useful, it's used in niche applications like things like, actually like a Coca-Cola bottle, right? There's some CO2 that forms the bubbles. But generally, the solution is to spend a lot of money to inject it into used up oil and gas wells and to try to keep it underground and hope it doesn't bubble back up.
Yeah, just bury it. Yeah.
Yeah. If you just hear that story, you understand this is really hard, right? It's a gas. Of course it wants to bubble back up.
Yeah.
Even if you store it in the ground. But that's the ideas that folks have thought of so far. However, we are doing something weird and interesting, and I think a lot more promising because we're pulling the carbon out from the natural gas before it's even combusted, which means CO2 never gets created in the first place, which is, first of all, really good. And second of all, what we're left with is actually solid carbon. So here, just to bring some props, right? Here's a jar of the carbon that modern hydrogen has captured. You can look, it's just literally, carbon is black, right? It's just powdery carbon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to blow your mind, right? I think one of the reasons why we've been so slow to address CO2 because we've been treating the atmosphere as a giant waste dump. CO2 also a gas, it's invisible, so you don't really see how much you're polluting. But this jar of carbon is equivalent to the CO2 that your home heating furnace would have created in just 30 seconds. So just in every 30 seconds, you're dumping like this much CO2 equivalents into the atmosphere.
Wow.
So that's why global warming is happening, right? Like you think, oh, the Earth's ginormous, how can human beings affect it? But we are dumping so much CO2 into the atmosphere. So, but yeah, like the neat thing, right? Because it's a carbon, this is a useful material that's actually already used in the economy. The specific name of the term is a material called carbon black. It's about, I think last year, a $17 billion per year commodity, been used in many applications. So for example, just to show you some things, right? Today, like our biggest market application is in asphalt. You know how roads are black? It's because it has a lot of carbon in it. So we just basically sell our carbon for roads. And this carbon is just locked in as a solid in the roads. That'll never turn back into CO2. It's a bit heavy, but like this is like a sample of the asphalt we can create with the carbon that we've sequestered. Today, we have carbon in asphalt, in roads and driveways and stuff like that in projects, California, Oregon, Washington. I think we're about to do our first project on the East Coast in the next week as well. That's pretty cool. Another use for carbon is actually ink. If you've ever seen like the black powder in your printer, that's because it's just carbon powder. So this is not like a huge market, but just as a demo, right? We've even made crayons with our carbon. Another big use is rubber. So your tires are also black because your tire by content, that rubber by content is about 30% just carbon. So this is just carbon. So this is rubber made with our carbon black. And so there's all sorts of applications that this carbon can be used to. But I think the key thing, right, is now it's an economically valuable product. We sell our carbon for a profit. We're not spending money to get rid of CO2 as a waste and storing it into the ground. And so that changes the whole economics of what you can imagine to deal with this issue of carbon.
Well, and I love how you're turning it into other things because there's a whole industry growing out there where people are just capturing it, like you said, storing it in the ground. Like what can you turn it into for a profit? And I mean, if you think the amount of roadways that are out there are rubber, I mean, how many cars do we have out there, right? Like that could be a huge industry. Can you use it for like thinking of more construction, like cement?
Oh yeah. So cement is one of the newer applications for this. So to give you a sense, right, this is cement we've made with some of our carbon black inside. Mm-hmm. So it actually strengthens the cement, which is really cool because that means you can use less cement, you save money. And also cement is one of the highest CO2 emitting parts of concrete. And so you're also offsetting that CO2 emission. But it does have some side effects, primarily of which is it turns the concrete black. So we're also exploring this market application, but I'm sort of assuming that it'll have to go into places where the concrete is not visible because people are just not used to
or maybe
dark
it's okay.
colored concrete.
I mean, with cement, I've talked about this on a previous episode too. I mean, it's the second most consumed substance on the planet next to water.
Yep.
And so, man, I mean, if you could just tap into that, I mean, there's a huge application for that right there. And I think cement's just interesting because back to reinventing, we're still using the same cement mix that was invented from like what was the name? I forgot the name of the company.
Portland cement.
It's and like the 1700s, right? Like it's the same mix. And so I often think about feedstock. I often think a lot about our waste stream and trying to figure out like, okay, how do you kind of take that value that's still in that waste stream and reroute it back into other things, and kind of like what you're doing, which is great because now you have a truly circular economy. I look back, I hope in the next 20 years we look back at this time as like the climate sustainability revolution. I'm pretty optimistic on that because there's a lot of people doing like with what you're doing. I just feel like we need to do it faster. But I think there's so many cool things that are happening out there, and you see this, from government to business I see a lot more people that are more mindful of these things and really paying attention. And so my hope is you just get more of these things moving. And what got us here, this is like 75 years post-industrial revolution. It's awesome. We've all benefited from a lot of these things, but I don't think we really thought about the downside of some of the systems and processes we put in place. We were just building our economy. The U.S. now is a $22 trillion GDP country,
Yeah.
which is awesome. But I also think it's time to kind of rethink things.
I agree. I love what you said about the circular economy, right? It's actually one of the most beautiful things as an environmentalist what OfferUp has done, right? Because we talk a lot about CO2, but that's not the only damage that mankind is inflicting on the planet. Like generally, we're mining a lot of stuff, we're harvesting a lot of forests, we're making a lot of land. We got to find a way to get by and use less stuff. And I think so OfferUp facilitating the circular economy, just like reusing stuff in the economy is incredible. And it goes into like what we're doing with the carbon, right? Like if we're gonna deal with all these energy issues, then we gotta be a bit smarter about how we're using all the different components, right? Like try to make useful byproducts instead of waste.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you look at your crystal ball and you kind of think about the next 5 to 10 years, like what are the things that get you excited when you get up in the morning? You're like, hey, this is so fun, and you're pretty optimistic about
My dumb answer is like the two metrics I sort of track in the company and in my head ultimately is like, revenue go up and to the right and CO2 avoided go up and into the right. For us, it's fairly simple that way. And the next, to be a bit more specific, right? Things that I'm excited about in the next decade include we're starting to do international expansion. Like I still think the USA is one of our biggest opportunities, but I said there's 3 million miles of gas pipelines in the United States, but natural gas is one of the biggest energy sources across the planet. It's like you'll find like the UK, much small. UK is like a state, right? Compared to the size of the United States. But United Kingdom has like, I think, about 500,000 miles of gas pipes. Germany, roughly the same. Japan, Korea, and all that. So we're starting to do our international expansion. So try to roll out the solution across the world. I think that's very exciting. I also think now that there's a lot more incentive and regulatory pressure to decarbonize industry. So talking about making stuff, right? One of the things that hydrogen is being thought of as an application, it goes beyond like planes and trucks. One of the challenge is high grade heat, meaning high temperature heat. We heat our homes, your hot water is probably 60 Celsius, that's fine. There's many ways to do that. But like making concrete has a step that's 1500 Celsius. Making silicon in your phone chips has a step that's over 1000 Celsius. Goes without saying, making steel, copper, all sorts of metals, right? Molten vats of metals all over 1000 Celsius. That high temperature heat is extremely hard to create. Today, we basically burn fossil fuels to do that. And so folks are interested in what else can we burn to create such a high temperature heat. Hydrogen is one of the most promising solutions. And so we're also excited about producing hydrogen for that market. And I think that market is going to get a lot more attention, right? Like people are starting to see, okay, it's not just about electricity. Like all these materials, how are we making them? And how can we decarbonize that? So I think that market is just at its beginning inflection point, but that's going to be a big attention area for companies and policymakers going forward, and that will accelerate adoption of hydrogen.
Do you think one of your biggest challenges? I mean, there's so much opportunity. It's kind of like, okay, how do you pick kind of which market to get after? Because, like you said, there's so many applications to what you're doing. Clearly you probably find more interest from ones that are clearly motivated, or how do you kind of prioritize all those opportunities?
Great question. I think we're going to eventually get kicked in the ass for doing too many things. But our way of cutting the Gordian knot, a lot of our biggest customers and supporters are utilities. So in some sense, we're agnostic to the use case. We work with it. The utilities basically, buy our technology, and then they can then use our technology to produce hydrogen themselves, and they can sell it to all sorts of customers, whether it's electric hydrogen or Zero Avia making hydrogen planes, they want a refueling hydrogen line, or as heavy industry, or some commercial building that was a decarbonized steam. The utility can handle a lot of that, and we just provide the technology. And then we also sell the carbon to make extra money and make sure it turns into sequestered material.
I'm trying to think of anything else we didn't cover. One thing I always like to try to understand for everybody that's watching is like, what can the average person actually do? So in this case, like when you think about hydrogen, is there anything that people can actually do to really make an impact rather than voting for the right politician, maybe.
Yeah, like in the case of hydrogen, I think hydrogen makes more sense in commercial and industrial applications. There are folks trying to make hydrogen work in residential applications. There's some projects in the UK, some in the US, some in Germany, but I'm a little bit more, far less aggressive on that. I think there are other solutions for decarbonization at your home. So really, for helping out in the hard to decarbonize sectors, I think it is more about politics and also voting with your wallet and your impact, right? It's one thing like buy products that come not only just from green energy but green materials. For example, right, the asphalt made from our carbon is way cleaner, much less CO2 compared to normal asphalt. So you can support that either by in your own projects, but also probably in voting for your city councils and working with their local policymakers, like all the projects that go to road, be supportive of new projects being built with green materials. You can also do that in terms of what you buy from the supermarket. But yeah, I think at least in terms of the hydrogen game, because you're affecting commerce and industry, there will be more of the case where it's not like installing something in your own home. It's more about affecting how companies produce their goods and affecting how policymakers mandate how companies should behave.
I think that's a big part. I wish policy and government was a little more aggressive. But part of my hope too is by reaching out and having a format like this where you engage the masses, now everyone's a little bit more knowledgeable, right? And so now they can do that. And I think that's part of the challenge I know I had when I thought about climate was I want answers. And why can't I just find this online, right? And so I do think there's a lot of opportunities to take this complex topic and then break it down and go, oh, now I actually understand. Like I understand what, hydrogen, how we can tap into it. I think there's a lot of complex things out there. Like I didn't know cement, for example, is the second largest consumed thing on the planet next to water. And so, I think if people are knowledgeable, then I hope people create more pressure and they can, vote and make changes. Because I think that it's going to take everybody. Like we can't wait for the government to act. Business, I think, is kind of too fragmented, but you need the masses to kind of groundswell around activity and say, hey, enough is enough. And hopefully, again, you just look out the window, right? So I've been pretty vocal with climate deniers these days. I'm like, okay, you're just not looking out the window. Forget about watching the news. I mean, you can say, I hate the news. Just look outside on what's happening. Like you cannot deny the impacts and what is actually occurring. This is not a natural ebb and flow. This is an up and to the right. And every year, as I look out the window this week and smoke. 6 years in a row, we're getting smoke now in Seattle. I've lived here my entire life. That never happened before. And
you can just right. We can all see Mount Rainier from different parts from Seattle. You can just see the snow line move gradually up every year, right?
And so,
like it's you don't need to take the science. Right, that's the nice thing about science. The whole point of science is you don't need to take the scientist's word for it. You can do the measurement yourself. There's an objective truth. You can just see it yourself.
Yeah, you can see it, and I think that's always the challenge. Again, I think with kind of global warming and things like this is like I actually think everything is just more severe. Like I think we have had the same number of fires, but then now they're burning much longer and they're more severe because of how dry everything is. And in Seattle, it's been a beautiful summer for the most part, but we only had rain one day out of the last 2 months, I think. So that becomes challenging. I've also been counting the number of fires. I live up on Cougar Mountain and I can see pretty far. Just average fires. I've seen now 7 fires, and this is not the forest burning. This is yards or buildings burning. And we watched one this week burn, and it's kind of sad. Like the house was probably 6,000 square feet. That thing, we watched it burn for 2 hours. And it was such a rager. The fire department just stands there. They let it burn. And then eventually, once they know that it's kind of burnt out, a lot of the energy is gone, then they'll go in. But they don't try to put it out right away because it's too far gone. But I've seen so many of those now because how dry everything is around here.
Yeah. I'm curious, what other effects of the general climate change have you already seen in your life and your business, right? Like we've all seen some versions, but I always love hearing stories of like other aspects of like how that's already affected you.
Well, I think for me personally, just again, awareness. And I've always been really clear. I am not a super crazy sustainability person. I'm very mindful of the planet. I care about the planet. I like to walk out in the woods. But I don't go above and beyond the convenience of my life to say, oh man, I'm never going to go on a plane, for example, right? And but as I've gotten more into this topic, I started to look at everything in my life and and start to really think about like, okay, what are the impacts of things? And I say this on a lot of episodes. I never have a plastic water bottle ever. Even if I go to a business meeting, they offer it. I said, nope, I'd rather just be thirsty, because of this is like, if you look at the plastics in our oceans, 25% of it comes from plastic water bottles and plastic grocery shopping bags. So if everybody did two things in their life, use the reusable bags and use reusable bottles, you can make an impact. Because again, I hear that from a lot of people. Oh, it's such a complicated thing. How am I going to make an impact? You can. You can do one little thing right now. All of us can go do that. I'm also mindful of just the products that we use. Ridwell here, Ridwell. And so they, all that plastic cellophane that you think, oh, where am I going to put this? We've been using that. Our laundry detergents, our soaps. We have now glass containers and these little teeny pills now. We don't have the big Tide, anymore. We don't do that anymore. I think there's just a lot more clothing's. I haven't bought clothes in a long time. I'm like, I don't need more t-shirts. In the past, I'm like, oh, I like that t-shirt. Now I'm kind of like, no, I know how the impact of a t-shirt. It's pretty significant, actually.
Oh, fashion's terrible for the planet and the climate. My company can't do anything about that. There's some people working on it, but I think it's like an underloved space. Pretty hard to decarbonize, but the footprint's humongous.
10% of all CO2 emissions come from clothing. Actually, more CO2 emissions come from clothing humans than every method of transportation combined. And if you think of the curve, right, of how much clothes we actually have now. Yeah. Because back to fast fashion, I hit the button, it comes to me. Yeah. And it's not just the clothing itself and the manufacturing of all that, but it's also the packaging. So if you think of the amount of waste, so 25% of all plastic waste comes from packaging. By 2026, we will ship 260 billion packages a year on the globe, which is crazy to think about, right? Yeah. So, these are all things I could talk for days on things I've been learning and discovering. And I'm generally a pretty curious person and generally pretty optimistic. But again, I look at everything kind of systemically as systems. I'm like, this is an issue because this is systems we've built for, 20, 30, 40 years, which is fine. But how do we rethink those things? And that's where I keep going circular, right? I think a lot of value is locked up locally. How do you tap into that? Everything from like our waste stream, like think about the amount of waste we produce. It's crazy. I see a lot of opportunity. I'm still, generally really optimistic, but I think companies like yours are awesome, right? Because you're going to unlock some of these things that are going to be huge catalyst for change into the future.
Yeah. I think this is hopefully one of maybe the defining fights of our generation, but I think it's doable. In fact, I'd say, I'm not sure I'm an optimist. I think I'm kind of like a realist or occasionally, a closet pessimist, but there's been many things in the last 12 years on this trajectory of the climate fight that have pleasant. I think if you just are objectively looking at data, things are bad, but everything's trending the right way. Sure, I think about the Paris Climate Agreement, this is 2015, when all the nations came together and first agreed we're all gonna do something about it. Yes. And then they set a target for by 2050, we'll aim to not long-term don't exceed 1.5 Celsius, right? Governments, right? Politicians, of course, set some very, very long distance goal that, they won't.
Hard to measure from today.
Yeah, but I just remember 1.5 Celsius. We breached that this year. It's only 2023. We've already passed that. So yeah, we're gonna need a lot of help, a lot of work, and I think it's gonna, even if you're not working in a climate tech company, there's a lot you can do by just being aware, affecting your own purchasing behavior, and affecting the politics of all this, just by making this a bigger issue.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Tony, thank you so much for being here. For anyone watching, check out, you can go to your website's really interesting, modernhydrogen.com, and just appreciate the time and what an interesting topic.
Thank you so much, Nick.